A woman has been murdered. Police are sure of that. But nothing else is what it appears to be. Investigators must sort out who's the victim and who's the killer. A father's greeting cards are no cause for joy when his daughter suspects he's not the man he pretends to be. To find the truth, detectives follow a paper trail through a maze of lies. A bungled murder and a twist of fate tip investigators off to a killer's elaborate scheme. But to win a conviction, they'll need his cooperation. Taking a life. Some killers take the phrase literally. After the kill, they assume their victims' lives, concealing their crime and hiding within their new stolen identity. Home to more than 1 million people, Detroit is Michigan's largest and toughest city. And like most metropolitan areas its size, it sees its share of crime. On May 4th, 1994, Betty Cole arrived at the Detroit Police Department to report her 32-year-old sister Annie missing. She said that Annie had left to run a quick errand with her boyfriend, Mo Jones, several hours earlier, but hadn't returned. Jones was allegedly involved in drugs, and Betty was worried that something bad had happened to her sister. But police policy requires at least 24 hours before a missing persons investigation can be opened. Betty would have to wait.
Why don't you go home? She's probably there asleep.
Though upset, she returned home, hopeful that her sister would soon turn up. The following morning, an anonymous 911 call brought police to an abandoned warehouse. When they arrived, Betty Cole and members of her family were waiting outside. Betty had also received an anonymous call from a man who claimed that her sister Annie was inside. Officers made their way into the building. At the end of a corridor, they found the lifeless body of a young woman. She had been shot 3 times in the head. Police returned outside and asked Betty to identify the body. When she saw the victim, she broke down. She confirmed that it was her sister, Annie Cole. Forensics technicians began processing the scene. Near the body, they collected 3 spent small caliber shells. They also found a purse nearby, but it contained no cash, credit cards, or any form of identification. The bullets recovered from the victim were sent to the Detroit Forensic Services Lab. There, Sergeant Paul Hartzell analyzed the slugs and the recovered shell casings using a digital micrometer.
The micrometer is a tool that we can use to help us determine caliber of a bullet or to help us determine a probable make of a particular bullet. This is done by mounting the bullet either with the base up so we can measure the diameter of the bullet to help us determine caliber, or we can actually measure the lands and grooves on the bullet to help us determine a probable make of a weapon that may have fired that bullet.
Each brand of gun creates its own characteristic pattern on a slug. And every individual firearm leaves unique marks on a bullet, like the gun's fingerprint. Analysis of the markings on the 3 slugs recovered from the victim led examiners to conclude that it was one gun, a .22 caliber Smith & Wesson that had been used to commit the murder, indicating a lone triggerman. Sergeant Patrick Hennahan of the Detroit Police Department began his investigation by looking for the last person reported to have been with Annie Cole. Her boyfriend, Mo Jones.
Trying to identify him and find out where he might be.
We weren't able to develop any information on a Mo Jones. We searched, department arrest records, narcotics bureau records, things of that nature. We weren't able to come up with anything.
While the search for the mysterious Mo Jones was underway, investigators tried to learn as much as they could about Annie Cole. The victim's fingerprints recovered from the crime scene were entered into the police database containing fingerprint records. After an extensive search, the database turned up no matches. Annie Cole had apparently stayed out of trouble until this terrible day.
That's all you know is it's on Finco.
Unable to locate the victim's boyfriend, Detective Hennahan relied on Betty Cole for information. But after a few days, it seemed she had disappeared.
I made another attempt after the weekend to contact her, and it was almost as if she had fallen off the face of the earth all of a sudden.
Pat, why don't you take a look at this?
With no clear leads in sight, he enlisted the aid of homicide detective Monica Childs.
We received from the
Her initial investigation revealed some troubling inconsistencies.
fingerprint identified as Annie.
Though the victim's prints were not on file with the police department, a records check revealed an extensive felony record under the name of Annie Cole.
That's Annie.
In fact, a warrant was currently out for her arrest on a probation violation. Trying to resolve the conflicting information, examiners compared the prints recovered at the crime scene with those contained in Annie Cole's criminal records. They didn't match. Annie Cole and the victim found at the warehouse were not the same person. And though there were several people named Annie Cole living in the Detroit metropolitan area, the victim and the known criminal shared a common address. Looking for answers, police went to the funeral home where the victim's body was being kept.
Could you give me some information on the Cole case?
There, the director stated that Betty Cole had been in 4 days earlier to request a speedy cremation for her sister.
She was in here 4 days ago.
Betty had stressed that there wasn't to be a service.
Well, it's strange when she knows there's an ongoing investigation.
The cremation was scheduled for the following day. For Detective Monica Childs, the arrangements made no sense.
Due to the age of the victim and me being an African American, I know culturally we have a service, okay? If there's no body, we have a memorial service. Even if the person is cremated, there's a service. And Pat and I talked about it. He said, that doesn't sound right. That sounds a little odd. I said, that is very unusual.
Here's some of the crime scene photos.
Investigators' strongest clue in this unusual case lay in a casket that was about to be incinerated.
She doesn't have her shoes on, but the shoes are there.
They obtained a court order to postpone the cremation. To sort things out, police needed to find Betty Cole, the woman who claimed to be the victim's sister. At the address Betty had given as her own, investigators were met by a man named James Shaver. He said he was Annie Cole's brother. He stated it was impossible that Annie had been murdered a week ago. He had just seen her the day before, leaving on a trip to Mississippi. hand, he had never heard of Betty Cole. He agreed to accompany police to the funeral home to try to identify the body. Shaver viewed the body with a total lack of recognition.
I don't know who this woman is. This is not my sister, no.
This woman, whoever she was not his sister, Annie. If anyone could identify the nameless victim found in the warehouse, it was the fictitious Betty Cole, who was nowhere to be found. For investigators, it was clear that she was deeply involved in this deadly charade. Detroit police struggled to make sense of a bizarre murder investigation. Forensic evidence proved that the young female victim thought to be Annie Cole was misidentified, and the woman who had ID'd her was now missing.
You've only talked to her over the phone. You've never seen
Hoping to give a name to the victim found shot to death in the warehouse, police scoured recent missing persons reports. One matched their victim.
You have a boyfriend?
Quinetta and Roy Spruill had reported their 28-year-old niece Stella missing on May 4th, the day before the body was found. Stella's co-workers had called the Spruills looking for her.
Doesn't make a lot of sense.
The employees said that when Stella left for lunch that day, she was going to meet someone, though she never said who. She seemed upbeat. But when Stella failed to return, they began to worry. The day after Stella's disappearance, a department store clerk called the Spruills looking for their niece. Stella had just applied for a credit card, and the store needed to verify some information on her application. The Spruills couldn't imagine that Stella would just take off without a word.
Stella Spruill, from what we learned from the family, was a religious young lady, a loyal friend, just an all-around good person.
Police asked the Spruills to view the body found at the warehouse, which had since been returned to the medical examiner's office. The victim was their niece, Stella Spruill. Now, police had to figure out who had murdered her and why. Detectives contacted the department store where Stella had allegedly filled out the credit card application. A surveillance camera had captured the transaction. Detectives recognized the woman in the video, and it wasn't Stella Spruill. It was the person who had identified herself as Betty Cole, the victim's sister, at the crime scene. Now, she was on tape impersonating Stella. And though investigators were convinced that the woman in the video was the real Annie Cole, they still had to determine how she was connected to Stella Spruill. Hoping to find an answer, they went to Stella's workplace. Employees there recognized the woman from the tape. Her name, they said, was Annie Cole. She used to work there with Stella, and the two were friends. For investigators, there was little doubt that Annie Cole was behind the murder of Stella Spruill. Now they needed proof. Police turned to Annie Cole's family for help. Annie's brother and one of her daughters were brought in for questioning. Police believed they might be able to identify the male voice on the anonymous 911 call that brought police to the warehouse where the victim's body was discovered. James Shaver didn't recognize the voice. But Annie Cole's daughter believed she did.
While listening to the copy of the 911 tape, the one daughter said, "Well, that's my cousin Leander."
Annie Cole's 17-year-old nephew, Leander Foster, was brought in for questioning. Police recognized him as being with the fictitious Betty Cole at the warehouse when the body was discovered.
Annie Cole.
Foster, who had no criminal record, broke down under questioning.
Asked me to help her out.
He admitted that Annie had promised him and his best friend $5,000 each to kill Stella Spruill.
She didn't want to go to jail, so
The day before the murder, Annie arranged to meet Stella at a mall parking lot. Leander and his partner were nearby, getting a look at their intended victim.
So, I mean, she showed us where she hangs out.
The next day, when Stella arrived on her lunch hour to meet Annie again, Leander Foster and his friend were waiting.
I'm Leander Foster.
They abducted her at gunpoint, forced her inside the car, and took her to the abandoned warehouse.
Get in that room right there.
There, Foster said he shot her 3 times with a .22 caliber Smith & Wesson that Annie had given him for the job. They cleaned out her purse and gave Stella's ID to Annie.
Warehouse, and we
The next day, after Annie Cole filed the false missing persons report, Leander called the police to report the body.
This is Annie's idea. This is all Annie's idea. So
He didn't know what
got
happened
her-
to the murder
got
weapon.
ID that she wanted.
On May 11th, 1994, a week after Stella Spruill was murdered, Annie Cole was tracked down at a relative's house in Indianola, Mississippi. She was arrested and taken back to Detroit for questioning. But police had already pieced together the motive behind Annie Cole's deadly scheme.
Annie Cole was probably a consummate con person. She was aware of outstanding warrants for her arrest and made a calculated decision that she didn't want to go back to prison. Based on her interviews with co-defendants and witnesses, she set in place a plan to assume another person's identity and disappear into the sunset, if you will, and live happily ever after.
To fake her own death, Annie needed a real victim. But she had no one in mind. The victim found her.
Yeah, this week has been good.
Stella Spruill called her former co-worker to invite her to a makeup demonstration. Annie declined, but realized in that instant who her victim was going to be. Trusting, hard-working Stella Spruill.
Bye.
Annie Cole was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Leander Foster also received a life sentence. The other accomplice pled guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Some people kill to purify their reputations. Others are motivated by pure greed. Bonner County, Idaho lies nestled between Washington State to the west and Montana to the east.
Here you go, Ted.
But in 1994, it found itself in the middle of a mystery. In late February, Shelley Kepley arrived at the Bonner County Sheriff's Office.
And everything seemed to be in order. What's his name?
She had flown in from Reno, Nevada to check on her father, Paul Gruber. who lived in the area.
Like perhaps he decided to take off?
She suspected that something was terribly wrong.
What?
Shelley said she'd last seen her father a month earlier when he'd come to Reno for the holidays. At age 54, he was independently wealthy as a result of good investments and had recently retired from teaching school. He'd been living in Idaho for about 6 months and seemed happy there. But over the past month or so, Shelley and her son had received several greeting cards and cash gifts from her father. But the signature on the cards didn't really look like his writing. And her repeated phone calls to him went unanswered. If he had gone on a trip, he would have told her his plans. Believing that someone may be impersonating her dad, Shelley didn't know where else to turn. Investigators forwarded the documents to the Idaho Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab. There, examiners compared Gruber's known writing samples with the signatures on the greeting cards. But there wasn't enough to work with, and examiners could not exclude Paul Gruber as the person who signed the cards. Though police had no evidence of foul play, they agreed to look into the matter. Under the circumstances, Shelley had been given power of attorney over her father's estate. She gave police permission to search his property. Lieutenant Harvey Thompson went to Gruber's house to look around. Shelley had told him that her father kept his financial records and an inventory of his possessions in a locked box hidden in the crawl space. Lieutenant Thompson went there to recover it.
There was an inventory in it. There were titles to vehicles in it. There was a little bit of jewelry in it and insurance papers.
With the inventory now in hand, investigators made their way through the house.
Empty.
Plastic sheets covering the furniture suggested that Gruber had gone away for an extended period of time. It soon became apparent that several items on the list were nowhere to be found. And they were not the type of things one packs simply to go on a trip.
I found out about guns being missing. I found out computer equipment that should have been there was gone. A gun safe was gone. Just a lot of stuff was gone.
It seemed Shelley Kepley's concerns about her missing father were well-founded. And though there was no physical evidence to support it, police were now starting to believe that harm had come to Paul Gruber. Police in Bonner County, Idaho, continued searching for clues in the mysterious disappearance of 54-year-old Paul Gruber. And though no one had heard from him in some time, his accounts were still active. While scouring financial records obtained from Gruber's bank, Lieutenant Thompson found something suspicious. Paul Gruber had been paying someone else's mortgage. And from what police had learned, that seemed completely out of character.
From talking to Shelley Kepley, Mr. Gruber's daughter, Mr. Gruber didn't pay other people's mortgages. He didn't loan other people his vehicles. You know, what's Mr. Gruber's pretty well stays Mr. Gruber's.
Darrell Kuehl, the man whose mortgage was being paid for by Gruber, was brought in for questioning. He told police he was a general contractor who had done extensive work at Gruber's house. He said he was starting a new home security business and other ventures that Paul Gruber had decided to invest in. Rather than investing cash, however, Gruber had agreed to make payments to Kuehl's mortgage company. To investigators, that arrangement didn't sound like something Shelley Kepley's father would agree to. To be certain they were talking about the same person, police showed Kuehl a photograph of Paul Gruber. But Kuehl didn't recognize him. That wasn't the man he knew. Someone else, it seemed, was trying to pass himself off as Paul Gruber.
This is Tony, I'm sketch artist. Now you tell him.
Investigators asked him to describe the man who hired him to a police sketch artist. If police were to have any hope of finding the missing Paul Gruber, they would first have to identify the imposter.
Sir, can I talk to you a moment?
Armed with the sketch, police canvassed Gruber's neighborhood,
County Police. I was wondering,
but nobody recognized the face.
I don't know. I've never seen a guy in the neighborhood.
And no one had seen Gruber for some time. As the race to put a name to the face in the sketch intensified, investigators got a break. The manager of the local post office had heard of the disappearance and informed police that Paul Gruber's mail was still being picked up from his P.O. box.
Yeah, sure. Listen, do me a favor.
He turned over a tape from a security camera that was located near Gruber's box. The video revealed 3 men at different times in the vicinity of Gruber's P.O. box. One of them, partially obscured and in profile, looked familiar.
One of the mails that was at Mr. Gruber's box during the period of time appeared to be that of Darrell Kuehl.
Suddenly, the investigation's best witness was becoming the prime suspect. Though the image on the video was not conclusive, it was enough for investigators to obtain a warrant to search Kuehl's property. Inside his home, they found a variety of tools, electronic equipment, and other items that were similar to those missing from Paul Gruber's residence. Darrell Kuehl insisted the things belonged to him. But detectives discovered that some of the items had serial numbers matching the inventory from Gruber's safe. Though police suspected Kuehl had killed Gruber and then assumed his identity in order to cash in on his victim's wealth, they found nothing to support a murder charge.
I had enough probable cause to arrest him for maybe theft and possibly forgery, but we didn't have a body. I couldn't prove that anything had actually happened to Mr. Gruber.
Feeling something may have been overlooked, Lieutenant Thompson ordered another search of Gruber's home. One of the investigators had found a strange depression in the crawl space, and the excavation team began digging beneath the house. They kept at it for hours, but with no luck. Then, about 2 feet down, they were overcome by the unmistakable smell of a decomposing body. Police in northern Idaho were getting closer to solving the mysterious disappearance of 54-year-old Paul Gruber. Digging in the crawl space of Gruber's home, police believed they had finally found him.
We went under the house and about 2.5 feet down found a white plastic trash bag, took it out, and found several pairs of glasses and glass case in it. Also a distinct odor of a deteriorating body.
17 months after being reported missing by his daughter, Paul Gruber's body was found, wrapped in an air mattress and buried beneath his own house. He had been shot 6 times. Police theorized that Paul Gruber had been killed in order to clear the way for someone to steal his identity and access his wealth. Investigators believed that someone was Darrell Kuehl. Now they had to prove it. And the best way to do that was to physically link him to the scheme to steal Gruber's identity. The greeting cards that Gruber's daughter received, allegedly from her father, were sent to the lab for DNA analysis. Examiners removed the stamps from the envelopes, hoping to find DNA from the person who mailed them. But according to Carla Finnis of the Idaho Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab, finding usable DNA samples on the back of a stamp was a long shot.
When you're talking about a stamp or an envelope, the cellular material comes from cells that have been sloughed off into the saliva from the cheeks and the tongue of the individual who licks the stamp or envelope. One can imagine that that's considerably less DNA than one would find in a normal blood sample.
Still, examiners were able to isolate and extract a single minute trace of saliva. The sample was enough for a DNA profile to be developed. Now, they needed a source of comparison. Despite his protestations of innocence, Darrell Kuehl was arrested for suspicion of murdering Paul Gruber. Once in custody, police wasted no time obtaining a blood sample. The evidence was sent back to the crime lab. Examiners generated a DNA profile of Darrell Kuehl. The results were then compared to the profile generated from the stamp. The conclusion was indisputable. Darrell Kuehl had licked those stamps. Police had made their case. From what investigators could determine, Kuehl had a history of shady business schemes. He saw his employer, the wealthy retired Paul Gruber, as an easy mark. But Gruber must have seen through the scams, refusing to be taken in. Kuehl then came up with another plan to get to his money. He would become Paul Gruber. Darrell Kuehl was found guilty of first-degree murder, grand theft, and forgery. He received 25 years for murder and 25 years for theft. A daughter's diligence made it hard for Kuehl to maintain his charade. But some predators rely on the vulnerability and isolation of their victims to work their schemes. On August 15, 1997, state police were dispatched to the home of 56-year-old Thomas Wayne Jones in Milford, Delaware. When Jones's home care nurse arrived for work, she found traces of blood on the floor. The house had been ransacked. Valuable coins and several financial records appeared to be missing. Her employer, who was confined to a wheelchair, was nowhere to be found.
Some firearms, and we're gonna need to take some prints. I'm gonna need a print kit.
Outside, police combed the grounds for any clues to Jones's whereabouts. One of the officers followed faint tire tracks that disappeared into a field. They led him 500 yards from the house and directly to the body of Thomas Wayne Jones. He had been shot in the back of the neck, but was still alive. Emergency personnel rushed to the scene. The wealthy entrepreneur was in critical condition, but still conscious. He managed to tell police the identity of his attacker, a longtime friend named George Calamares. Jones said that after being shot, Calamares placed him in a white pickup truck and dumped him in the field. A warrant was issued for Calamares' arrest. Records indicated that Calamares was living across the Delaware border in Silver Spring, Maryland. There, officers from the Montgomery County Police Department were asked to bring in the suspect in the shooting of Thomas Wayne Jones. But when police went to pick Calamares up, he wasn't home. Calamares' wife, Noreen, stated that she had not heard from her husband in a few days. But she agreed to contact the police if and when she heard from him. Police were skeptical that Calamares' wife would actually turn him in. But a few hours later, Montgomery County Detective Terry Ryan received a call.
Mrs. Calamares notified the police once she was contacted by George Calamares. He was living in a wooded area, essentially on the lam, close to the home, and he contacted her in an effort to get some money and clothing.
Mrs. Calamares told police that her husband was on his way to a nearby convenience store to buy supplies. When he exited the store, police were waiting. They moved in and made the arrest. He was transported to the Maryland Detention Center and booked for the attempted murder of Thomas Wayne Jones. Calamares admitted he was friends with Jones. Having recently returned to the area after living in North Carolina, Calamares had gone to visit Jones that morning. He strongly denied any knowledge of the attack. Though investigators suspected that Calamares was lying, they had no obvious motive and no hard evidence linking him to the crime. Believing Calamares' truck used to transport the victim into the field would yield valuable clues, police spent the next few months trying to track it down. But its whereabouts remained unknown. Then they got a tip. An anonymous caller told police that the pickup truck could be found at a machine shop in nearby Dickerson, Maryland, owned by one of Calamares' friends. But when they arrived, investigators saw no sign of the truck. The shop owner denied any knowledge of the vehicle, though he admitted he was friends with George Calamares. The lead appeared to be a waste of time, until a bundle of mail caught the detective's eye. The name on the letters bore a striking similarity to the name of the shooting victim in Delaware.
It was several pieces of mail from a bank in North Carolina addressed to a person named Gary Wayne Thomas. We knew that this similarity in names, our Delaware victim, Thomas Wayne Jones, was probably more than a coincidence. In fact, at the point we expected it was probably some alias that Calamares had contrived from the Jones case.
The shop owner claimed that he didn't know who Gary Wayne Thomas was. He said Thomas's mail arrived there and George Calamares picked it up. And now that Calamares was in prison awaiting extradition to Delaware, his wife collected it. Unsure if this clue was related to the shooting of Thomas Wayne Jones in Delaware, Montgomery County Detective Joe Mondano contacted the North Carolina bank to see if there really was a client by the name of Gary Wayne Thomas.
Thomas Wayne Jones.
They said, yes, there was. And I said, well, can you describe him to me? And I fully expected them to describe the way George Calamaris looks. And they described somebody completely different. And I asked, well, when is the last time you saw Gary Wayne Thomas? And the bank said, well, come to think of it, probably 1996, the middle of 96. And this was over a year later.
According to bank records, Gary Wayne Thomas was worth millions, and no one had seen him in over a year.
You'll see they continue.
As police struggled to figure out the connection, word came in that Thomas Wayne Jones died as a result of his injuries from the shooting attack. Now, police shifted their focus to building a murder case against their suspect, George Calamaris. While police struggled to link George Calamaris to the murder of Thomas Wayne Jones in Delaware, their investigation uncovered a strange clue. Calamaris was receiving mail from a bank in North Carolina for a man named Gary Wayne Thomas. Unsure who this person was or how he was connected to George Calamaris, authorities contacted police in North Carolina. Detective Ricky Best of the Greenville Police Department was asked to pursue the lead.
They were asking me to check at a certain location here in Greenville to try to locate Gary Wayne Thomas. That they were investigating a murder case themselves, and they wanted to find out if Gary Wayne Thomas existed.
Detective Best began by speaking to the manager of the bank where the letters to Gary Wayne Thomas originated. She confirmed that Thomas was indeed a real person, and he was living off the interest of a trust fund worth more than $1 million. His account was still active, and money was being withdrawn regularly. But over the past year, he communicated solely through letters and rare phone calls. Looking for answers, Greenville police contacted Thomas's family. His father confirmed that he had set up the trust fund for his son. He said Gary was a troubled young man who battled drug and alcohol dependency. Worried about his son's well-being, he instructed the family attorney to draw up the trust. He hoped the fund would limit the amount of money Gary could access to purchase drugs and alcohol. But the arrangement had caused friction, and Mr. Thomas had little contact with Gary after that. In fact, he hadn't heard from his son in over a year. The information put investigators no closer to establishing the connection between Gary Wayne Thomas and George Calamaris. They needed to find Thomas. Hoping to track him down, police contacted the apartment manager of his last known address.
She said that Gary Wayne Thomas disappeared sometime around June or the first part of July of 1996. That she thought it to be odd because he left all of his belongings there in the apartment. But one of Gary's friends, she referred to him as George Calamaris, told her that Gary was away in Maryland.
Police had established that George Calamaris and Gary Wayne Thomas had lived in the same apartment complex in North Carolina and were friends. Now, the wealthy Gary Wayne Thomas was missing. The information was passed on to the Maryland detectives. Police now feared that Gary Wayne Thomas had met the same fate as Thomas Wayne Jones in Delaware, that he had been murdered in an attempt to get at his money. but they had no proof that anything had actually happened to Gary Wayne Thomas. In fact, money was still being withdrawn from Thomas's account through a bank in Silver Spring, Maryland. But it couldn't be Calomares making the withdrawals. He was in prison.
Well, we asked the bank to please keep the account open. Don't close it. Allow the withdrawals to continue so we could start tracing them. And when we did that, we immediately, from the codes, from the transaction codes, we could find out what bank the money was being withdrawn from in Maryland, obtained the bank film, and the first film we obtained, the person obtaining the money was Noreen Calomares, George's wife.
Noreen Calomares, who had been cooperative since early in the investigation, was arrested for bank fraud and money laundering. A subsequent search of the Calomares home uncovered Gary Wayne Thomas's ATM card and some unmailed letters allegedly signed by him asking his bank to increase his monthly allowance. Noreen told police that after her husband was arrested, their friend at the machine shop started bringing over Thomas's mail. It included bank statements, the ATM card, and blank checks. She said that her husband told her that Thomas had given them permission to use the items. Noreen hadn't seen or heard from Thomas since she left North Carolina with George Calomares several months earlier. The information prompted investigators to search Calomares' jail cell. Several typewritten letters ready to be mailed to the bank in North Carolina, signed Gary Wayne Thomas, were confiscated. Because the U.S. mail was being used to perpetuate the crimes, the evidence was forwarded to the U.S. Postal Inspection Service Crime Lab in New York. There, Forensic Sciences manager John Schatz compared handwriting from the documents found in Calomares' house and jail cell against known samples of Gary Wayne Thomas.
We know that we never write exactly the same way. If we have writings that is exactly the same, it's usually an indication that it is a trace forgery or another type of photocopy that has been reproduced and the document has been altered. But in many cases, what we do is we compare the idiosyncratic movement, we make a comparison of the similar motions and dissimilar motions, and then we become a determination if they're written by the same author.
Besides the shape and slant of the letters, analysts also look for the pressure on the page and places where a forger paused to consciously form his letters a certain way. These pen lifts can be a tip-off to a forgery.
When we made those comparisons, we were able to determine that Mr. Calomares was the author of the Gary Thomas signatures on the typewritten letters.
Unable to dodge the evidence, Calomares knew his run was over. To avoid the death penalty, he confessed to his crimes. He told investigators that he had been friends with Gary Wayne Thomas, but soon became jealous of his wealth. He plotted to kill him and take over his life, or at least his trust fund. In July 1996, Calomares offered to show Thomas some marijuana plants he said he was growing in a field near the apartments. But when they drove out there, Calomares shot Thomas dead. He left him in the woods, then later returned to scatter the remains so they would never be found. The crime went undetected for almost 3 years. Financially, It had worked out well for Calamares, but it wasn't enough. Soon after returning to Maryland, he began devising another scheme. He would kill his friend, Thomas Wayne Jones, assume his identity, and cash in on his victim's wealth. The plan backfired, however, when Jones lived long enough to identify his attacker. For his crimes, George Calamares received 395 years for the federal crime of bank fraud, life in prison for the murder of Thomas Wayne Jones, and 45 years for the murder of Gary Wayne Thomas. Noreen Calamares received 6 months of house arrest for money laundering and mail fraud. For some murderers, taking a life is not enough. They want to become their victims. The result is an ongoing deception that's difficult to maintain. Each day increases the chances that a killer will be exposed, hiding behind a stolen identity. In Virginia, a classified ad lures a crazed gunman to his victim's home. Police must try to unravel the killer's identity through a few spent bullet casings. An internet romance turns deadly, and Texas authorities have no way of identifying the suspect. They turn to computer experts to track a killer through cyberspace. In California, 2 women are murdered at a movie studio theme park on Mother's Day. Detectives must rely on the victims themselves to point them to the killer.
You got the wrong guy. Hey.
Often, victims of homicide are lured to their deaths by someone they know and perhaps even trust. But forensic examiners can expose the deception and reveal the killer who harbors deadly intentions. On the evening of September 24, 1997, officers from the Newport News, Virginia Police Department were dispatched to the home of 35-year-old Harry Kaiser. One of the man's friends was worried about his safety and called 911. When the officer arrived a few minutes later, no one appeared to be home. But when he made his way around the side of the house, he spotted a man lying motionless on the floor, taped to a chair. Unsure if the attacker was still in the house, the officer cautiously made his way inside. After securing the scene, he went to the victim's aid. The man, identified as Harry Kaiser, was gagged and bound with electrical tape. Though he had been shot in the head, he still had a faint pulse.
2124, send me a medic to this location. I have 1 male with a gunshot wound to the head.
Paramedics rushed to the scene. Harry Kaiser was in grave condition. After removing the gag, the responding team went to work on the victim. Officers pried a .22 caliber pistol from Kaiser's grip. The gun appeared to be jammed. Kaiser was rushed to the hospital. Shortly after arriving there, however, he lapsed into a coma. Detectives and forensic technicians were summoned to the scene to begin their investigation. Inside the home, they found no signs of a forced entry, But there were clear signs of a violent struggle and indications that it had escalated into a gunfight. A small caliber bullet, consistent with having come from Kaiser's .22, was found lodged in the wall. Several spent 9mm shells were also recovered near where the victim was found. On the floor, examiners found and collected a hoop earring. And there was one other potential clue. The title to Kaiser's Porsche, which was still parked in the driveway, was found lying out. All of the items were collected and sent to the crime lab.
Noticed mostly was there was two taillights in
Detectives
the back,
began interviewing Kaiser's neighbors.
saw someone never seen before in the area.
Only
came out
one
of the
had
house,
useful information.
got into a vehicle.
A few hours earlier, a man who lived across the street saw a tall, dark figure rush toward a vehicle parked in front of Kaiser's home and then quickly speed away. But the witness hadn't been wearing his glasses at the time and could offer no description of the man he saw. Detective Richard Gaddis was only able to uncover one clue.
This witness did note that the vehicle that this figure got into had a high third mounted tail light on the back of it. That's all he could see with his poor vision as it went down the street.
Your relationship.
Hoping to find more useful information, investigators turned to the woman whose 911 call brought police to Kaiser's home the night before. She explained that Kaiser was selling his Porsche through a newspaper ad. He had told her that one prospective buyer, a tall, young African-American male, called him on his cell phone repeatedly and dropped by the house unannounced on a few occasions. The friend stated that shortly before the shooting, Kaiser called her and said the buyer had stopped by again. After a brief visit, the man left, saying he was going to the store and would return shortly. But Kaiser sensed that he was up to something. He armed himself with his .22 caliber pistol and asked his friend to call him back in half an hour.
No, I don't. No, this is like the middle of the transaction.
When she did, there was no answer.
Now, what about the...
Though detectives were certain that the car deal had somehow turned violent, they struggled to identify a suspect. Investigators hoped that an examination of the physical evidence could help them develop a profile of the man responsible for the assault. Technicians at the Newport News Police Crime Lab processed the victim's clothes for any stray hairs or fibers that may have been left behind. But other than the tape used to bind Harry Kaiser, examiners found nothing. Looking to generate a lead, detectives released details of the assault and the investigation to area law enforcement agencies. A short while later, they got a tip from police in nearby York County, Virginia. A few months before Harry Kaiser was attacked, a York County man selling a luxury automobile had a confrontation with a menacing car buyer.
I'm asking $28,000.
A tall, young African-American man accused the seller of not thinking he was good enough to own a fancy car.
Huh? I can afford this car, man.
The seller feared the man enough that he immediately reported the incident to police. The suspect reportedly drove a Geo Tracker, a vehicle with a high-mounted third taillight, like the one seen leaving Kaiser's home the night he was shot. Newport News police were convinced the same man was responsible for both incidents. Investigators knew they had to find a way to identify this violent suspect before he found another victim. Detectives obtained a warrant for Harry Kaiser's cell phone records and searched for unfamiliar numbers.
We sat down with the phone records and weeded out all the people known to Harry Kaiser, his family, his friends. There was one telephone number on that phone record that was unusual to him.
It was traced to a home in nearby Hampton, Virginia, and it had been placed at 6:45 on the evening of the shooting.
The number right here looks familiar to you.
The homeowner knew
No.
nothing of the call or of Harry Kaiser.
So you probably didn't call that by any property.
The lead appeared to be a
car,
dead end.
house, anything of that sort.
But then, the woman added that her 22-year-old son had recently been looking to purchase a new vehicle.
Just a car. Just a car. Just a car.
His name, she said, was James Gatling.
He usually comes home in there.
Gatling was contacted and brought in for questioning.
Altercations.
Though he matched the descriptions given by Kaiser's friend and the man from York County, he hardly seemed like a person capable of violence.
Are you employed, sir?
Gatling admitted owning a geo-tracker and was upfront about having visited both the man in York County and Harry Kaiser.
I don't know. He didn't mind admitting that he was, in fact, the person that had been to Harry Kaiser's house on several occasions looking at this Porsche, but he simply denied having anything to do with the shooting or being there when the shooting occurred.
You're right there. Now,
When asked
where did
about
you-
an
where did that
injury
come
to one of his earlobes, Gatling could offer no explanation.
from? I don't know. I've got
And though the injury was consistent with evidence recovered from the crime scene, police had no way to prove it. After several hours of questioning, they had no choice but to release James Gatling. 3 days after the shooting, word came in that Harry Kaiser died from injuries sustained during the assault. James Gatling was now the prime suspect in a murder investigation. And accounts of his unpredictable behavior led police to fear that he was capable of more deadly violence. Police in Newport News, Virginia, were closing in on a suspect in the shooting death of 35-year-old auto mechanic Harry Kaiser.
Okay.
Though James Gatling admitted being at the victim's house the night of the murder, investigators lacked physical evidence that could tie him directly to the crime. Looking for a way to connect Gatling to the murder, investigators forwarded the 9mm shell casings recovered from the crime scene to examiner John Ward at the Virginia State Bureau of Forensic Science in Norfolk.
We got involved in this case when I received a phone call from Detective Gaddis, who indicated that there had been a murder in his city, and they had some cartridge cases from the crime scene, and they'd had a suspect but no firearm. Was there anything we could do for him?
Using a comparison microscope, Ward confirmed that all of the 9mm casings were fired by the same weapon. After thoroughly photographing the evidence using a digital camera, Ward then entered the images into a national computer database called DrugFire. This database can tell examiners if bullets found at a crime scene were fired from a particular weapon that has been previously test-fired in connection with another crime. When a bullet is fired, imperfections in the gun barrel etch a pattern onto the shell cartridge. Examined microscopically, these scratches and swirls are as individual as a fingerprint. The DrugFire database looks for other shell casings on file that have similar markings. When Ward finds a potential match, he superimposes the images to see if they share the same unique signature. Ward found that the gun used to kill Harry Kaiser had been test-fired in connection with another crime less than a year before. Police now needed to find out who had owned the weapon at the time. Investigators requested the case file and learned that 22-year-old James Gatling had owned the gun. 9 months earlier, Gatling was suspected of firing the weapon into a restaurant. But ballistics tests back then showed that Gatling's gun had not fired the shot. Though he and his gun were cleared in the incident, a record of his weapon would remain a permanent entry in the DrugFire database.
Once a weapon is analyzed and connected to a person, that remains a digital image for forever. So in a way, you've always got that gun. Even if you don't have the actual gun itself, you've got all of its markings, and you know who it belonged to, at least at one point.
For investigators, it was a huge break in the case. Not only did Gatling admit to knowing the victim, he was now linked to the murder weapon. On October 2nd, 1997, James Gatling was arrested for suspicion of murder.
Turn the vehicle off!
His vehicle was towed to the police impound lot for a closer examination.
Step out of the vehicle!
Police obtained a warrant to search Gatling's home, but the 9mm weapon was nowhere to be found. Without it, investigators still hadn't conclusively tied the suspect to the killing. Police searched Gatling's vehicle for anything that could help physically link him to Kaiser's murder. Though no weapon was found, police uncovered something they hoped would finally seal the case. A roll of black electrical tape similar to the tape that was used to bind Harry Kaiser to the chair. In the lab, technicians unrolled every piece of tape that had been collected from the crime scene and compared the broken or torn ends to the end of the black electrical tape found in Gatling's car. The tears from the two pieces of tape lined up perfectly. Now there could be no doubt. James Gatling was responsible for the death of Harry Kaiser.
Put your hands up! Hands up! All right? Hands up! Sit in the chair!
Police believe that shortly after Harry Kaiser talked with his friend on the phone, James Gatling returned to the house. Motivated by an unexplainable rage, Gatling overpowered his victim and bound him to a chair. After getting off one shot, Kaiser's gun jammed. Gatling then shot the 35-year-old mechanic and left the scene. James Gatling was convicted of the first-degree murder of Harry Kaiser and sentenced to life in prison. In the Gatling case, detectives tracked a killer who tried to hide behind the anonymity of classified ads. To catch a murderer in Texas, investigators would have to follow a mystery woman through an even more complex maze. In April 2000, 20 miles southwest of Austin in the hill country of central Texas, a rancher surveying his property noticed a blanket lying on the side of a trail. When he looked underneath, he discovered the remains of a decomposing human body. Deputies from the Hays County Sheriff's Office and officers from the Texas Rangers were quickly dispatched to the scene. After securing the area, the team began processing it for clues. But there was little physical evidence to be found. Recent rains had washed away any trace of the killer that might have been left behind. Other than the victim himself and the blanket used to cover him, nothing of any forensic value was found. Investigators speculated that he had been lying there for close to 2 weeks. And prolonged exposure to the Texas sun had left the body in a severe state of decomposition. According to Captain Sam Williams of the Hays County Sheriff's Office, identifying this victim would be a challenge.
Due to the advanced state of decomposition, there was no available fingerprints, and so we weren't going to be able to come up with anything there.
At autopsy, the medical examiner determined the victim had died as a result of a .22 caliber bullet to the head, most likely made by a high-powered rifle. But there was no way to determine how old the victim was or what he looked like in life. And with over 70,000 missing persons cases reported in Texas each year, investigators realized that searching through those reports for a match would be overwhelming.
I think it's the angle that it's taken.
The victim's teeth were carefully documented and photographed for future comparisons. To aid in the identification process, investigators called on the expertise of Dr. Dave Glassman, a professor of forensic anthropology at Southwest Texas State University.
One.
Measuring the width of the brow ridge and the dimensions of the eyes and nose, Dr. Glassman found this skull was consistent with a Caucasian male. To pinpoint his age, he examined the sutures, the areas where the bones of the skull connect to one another that close over time. One, called the basilar suture due to its location at the base of the skull, closes in most individuals between the ages of 19 and 24 years of age.
The determination that I made was the basilar suture had closed, suggesting that the individual was older than about 19 or 20, but the internal sutures were just in their very initial stages of closure, indicating that the individual would have been between about 19, 20, and 30 years of age.
With Dr. Glassman's analysis, detectives could narrow their search of missing persons to young white males. And though several files matched those criteria, only one had been reported a few weeks before this victim was discovered. A records check indicated that 20-year-old Carrie Cuyava, a sophomore from Texas A&M University, had been reported missing to campus police 2 weeks earlier by his parents and his roommate at the university. Having only the victim's teeth to help them make an identification, detectives quickly contacted Cuyava's family dentists.
Over the phone, their dentist literally described verbatim every tooth in the mouth to an exact match, which in forensic world is almost as good as a fingerprint or as good as a fingerprint.
The search for a missing university student had met head-on with a murder investigation. But with no solid evidence pointing to a suspect, investigators were still a long way from putting this case to rest.
Okay.
Authorities in Texas had identified human remains found on a secluded ranch as belonging to missing 20-year-old Texas A&M sophomore Carrie Cuyava. Looking to identify a suspect, investigators questioned Cuyava's roommate at the university who had reported him missing. He told detectives that just before the disappearance, Cuyava had made plans to visit a San Antonio woman whom he'd befriended 3 months earlier in an internet chat room.
Oh, she's gorgeous, man. You want to take a look at her picture real quick?
Though they had never spoken directly, Cuyava seemed enamored by photographs sent by the young woman, whose name was Kelly McCauley.
She's good looking, man.
Detective Will Scott of the University Police Department learned details of the chat room romance.
The day that Kerry left Texas A&M was the day that he was supposed to meet Kelly for the very first time in person in San Antonio. The reason being that they had not spoken before, according to the roommates and friends. Kerry had told them that Kelly had her jaw broken by an ex-boyfriend. Consequently, the jaw was wired shut and she wasn't able to speak on the phone. However, she was able to communicate over that 3-month period by computer.
Studious, so it's kind of unlike him.
The roommate said Kerry left in his car for San Antonio and was supposed to return by the end of the weekend, but he never showed. However, over the course of the following days, he received emails from Cuyava saying that he was having a great time with Kelly and was going to stay a little while longer. Investigators needed to question Kelly McCauley, possibly the last person to have seen Carrie Cuyava alive. But the young blonde woman's whereabouts turned out to be a mystery in itself.
If we could match that, not that I'm aware of.
Investigators could find no record of her in San Antonio or anywhere else in the state.
Telephone companies
And tracking her down through her chat room login name proved more difficult than detectives anticipated.
with simple email, that's pretty easy to trace. But when you enter the realm of internet relay chat, it's pretty anonymous. And there's many different levels that you can go through to even make it more and more anonymous.
To investigate.
As Hayes County detectives continued searching for the elusive Kelly McCauley, campus police at Texas A&M University uncovered a lead. Kerry Kuyava's car had been located at an airport near campus. A parking stub indicated it had been left there on April 10th, just a few days after he left for San Antonio to meet Kelly. The car was impounded and taken for a closer forensic evaluation. Detectives processed every square inch of the car, searching for any clue regarding Kerry's murder. In the hatchback, they found dried human blood. Tests later proved that it had come from the murdered student's body. But with no fingerprints found, determining who had been at the wheel would be difficult. The following day, Kerry's roommate contacted investigators.
Just sit at your desk.
Yeah.
He had recalled something he now believed was vitally important. In the days after Kerry had left for San Antonio, he returned to his dorm room and found a young man working at Kerry's computer. The man introduced himself as Kelly McCauley's brother.
Hi.
He said he was retrieving schoolwork for Kerry Kuyava. Unaware that his roommate was in danger, he didn't think anything of it at the time. Police were convinced that Kelly and her brother were somehow involved in Kerry's murder. But tracking these mysterious siblings along traditional routes had been unsuccessful. If police were ever going to solve this case, they had to find a way to track them down in the complex world of cyberspace.
There was nobody that was initially involved in this investigation from any of the agencies that we knew about that had any kind of expertise in the IRC platform or this form of communication or chat rooms or anything along those lines. So it was virgin territory for us.
Things were looking grim until an article about the case in the local paper brought a chat room veteran named Kerry Lee to police. He'd interacted with both the victim and the suspect online. And Kelly McCauley just couldn't stop talking about her blossoming new romance.
And we would hear from her that he was at her house or apartment or wherever, and he was in the kitchen studying, or he was in the couch watching TV, or Kerry and I are going to a movie tonight, and we heard details, again, that we didn't really want to hear. But it was all she wanted to talk about, and this went on and on and on and on and on.
It went on, investigators realized, days after Kerry was already dead. Police were learning a lot about Kelly McCauley, except where to find her or her brother.
I made a copy.
Lee offered to help. He handed over a disc containing a phone number that Kelly McCauley had once given him. Investigators traced the number to a woman in San Antonio. There was no Kelly McCauley living here, she said, only Kenny Lockwood, her 31-year-old son. At present, he was ailing in the hospital. Too sickly to work, Kenny had two loves in his life, his mother said: computers and Texas A&M University.
AOL?
Since being rejected by the college the year before, Lockwood spent at least 12 hours a day chatting on the university's website. With a warrant in hand, investigators searched the home. They noticed a red stain on the carpet under the couch. Tests proved the substance was human blood. Investigators searched Kenny Lockwood's bedroom.
Look what I got.
In the back of his closet, they found a weapon consistent with the type that had killed Carrie Kuyava. More incriminating, however, was a photograph found on Kenny Lockwood's desk.
Grab that.
It was the woman they'd been hunting, a photograph of the person they knew as Kelly McCauley, and it had been torn out of a magazine. It now appeared to investigators that Kelly McCauley was a fictitious creation. Kuyava's dream girl was nothing but a decoy.
Good.
Investigators confiscated Lockwood's computer, floppy disks, and a number of documents. The only way to prove that he'd lured Carrie to his death was to scour his and Carrie's computers and retrieve all of the conversations that had taken place online between the fictitious Kelly and the unsuspecting Carrie Kuyava. David Burns of the Hays County Sheriff's Office was one of the investigators who scrutinized the files.
We took all of this information and then began pouring through everything that had been talked about on all those computers, that had been talked about in chat rooms, that had been talked about on emails, that had been, any conversations whatsoever that had been done online. We went through and poured over every bit of that information.
The recovered logs and conversations showed that the fictitious Kelly would chat online for hours, especially with Carrie. Lockwood, pulling the strings, encouraged Carrie Kuyava's attraction. Ultimately, he suggested that the two get together in person.
Hey, is Kelly home?
Investigators suspect that when Carrie showed up in San Antonio, Lockwood posed as Kelly's brother. Though no one will ever know what motivated Lockwood, the hole in Carrie Kuyava's skull told investigators what happened next.
At some point in time, things went wrong. Carrie Kuyava was sitting on the couch when he received a .22 caliber bullet wound to the back of the skull, fell forward onto the floor, and was probably deceased before he hit the floor.
Lockwood then placed the body in the trunk of Carrie's car, drove to a rural site, and abandoned his victim. He continued the charade by writing emails from Carrie's computer to the victim's friends and family, assuring them he was alive. And most likely, he deleted a large number of files from Carrie's computer in the hopes that detectives would never catch on to his drawn-out plan.
Here's Mr. Lockwood.
On April 27, 2000, Kenny Lockwood, still recovering in the hospital from an unidentified illness, was arrested for murder. Under questioning, he admitted to the crime.
He did provide us with a partial confession. At one point in time, he actually admitted to the shooting having occurred in his residence. He explained to us the history between he and Carrie, that they admit on, and that he was posing as this Kelly.
But he would never stand trial for his crimes. A few months after his arrest, Kenny Lockwood took his own life.
She's beautiful. You want to take a look at her picture?
Carrie Kuyava was lured into believing that a stranger was a friend. But even an evening with one's own family can turn deadly. Los Angeles, California is home to 9.5 million people, many drawn here by the promises of fame and fortune. But on Mother's Day night, 1995, the upper level of the City Walk parking garage became the backdrop for one family's nightmare. Around 11 p.m., paramedics and deputies from the LA County Sheriff's Department were dispatched to the garage. 30-year-old Paul Carassi and his 2-year-old son had survived an assault by unknown assailants. But Paul's mother 61-year-old Doris Karasi and his ex-girlfriend, 29-year-old Sonia Salinas, did not. The two women had been nearly decapitated in a vicious knife attack. As Paul Karasi was taken to the hospital with a severe knife wound to the hand, police began processing the scene. Personal items found near the victims suggested the ambush had been sudden and without warning. Police carefully documented and collected dozens of bloodstains. As investigators continued searching for evidence to help them piece together what had happened, a 911 call came in to police dispatch. There had been another stabbing, less than 5 miles away. As officers from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office continued processing the scene of a brutal double murder, word came in that another stabbing had been reported a few miles away. Lying by the side of the highway, police found 44-year-old Donna Lee. Barely conscious, she said that someone had tried to rob her and steal her car after she pulled off the road. She had been stabbed in the abdomen and was severely bleeding. Despite the life-threatening injury, she somehow managed to fight off her attacker. Donna was rushed to the hospital. Police began searching the area for clues to the assailant's identity. A few feet from where Donna Lee was found, they discovered several items belonging to the victims of the City Walk garage knife attacks. They recovered Sonia Salinas' identification, a fanny pack belonging to Paul Karasi, and his mother's blood-stained purse. Nearby, officers found another clue. A blood-stained knife, possibly the one used in all of the assaults. Someone, it seemed, had gone on a violent rampage that spanned several miles. All of the evidence, including Donna's vehicle, were collected and forwarded to the crime lab for a closer examination. Sergeant Sam Muniz of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department was assigned to the case.
How many times did you see that particular night?
The brutality of the murders that took place at the parking garage was difficult to comprehend.
Okay, it was already late.
What motivates somebody to do that? You know, especially the way it's done. Because you look at these two victims and you look at, they're nearly decapitated. I mean, there's stab wounds from one side to the other and all over the bodies. I mean, this guy was either angry, if he lost it mentally, you know.
A few hours after the assaults, investigators went to Paul Karasi's residence to notify his family that he was recovering in the hospital. Though no one appeared to be home, they noticed something strange. Paul Karasi shared an address with someone named Lee, the same last name as the victim found along the highway.
Called in on the radio, had it checked out. Police department.
Believing it had to be more than a coincidence, detectives went to the hospital to interview Karasi. He told investigators that he'd taken his mother, Doris, his ex-girlfriend, Sonia, and their 2-year-old son out for a Mother's Day dinner. As they made their way back to the car, someone suddenly attacked him from behind, forcing him to the ground. He heard screams and tried to fight back. But when he tried to grab the knife from the assailant, his hand was badly cut. He was then knocked unconscious. When he came to, he discovered the bodies of his mother and Sonia. Paul stated that he did in fact know Donna Lee, the victim found on the side of the highway. He worked with her at a local bank, and the two were romantically involved. They had recently moved in together. In fact, his relationship with Donna had caused friction between him and his ex-girlfriend, Sonia Salinas, who also worked at the bank.
Okay, we can do that.
Sonia was seeking sole custody of their 2-year-old son and the garnishment of Paul's wages for child support. Despite those tensions, Paul couldn't imagine anyone who would want to target him or his family.
We had finished having dinner and
Convinced that the two assaults were somehow connected, examiners at the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department Crime Lab hoped an examination of the evidence would point them toward a suspect. They began by analyzing the bloody knife found at the Donna Lee crime scene. Serological tests confirmed that blood from all 4 victims was present on the knife. But no suspect fingerprints were found. Desperate to identify the killer before he struck again, investigators began scouring Donna Lee's car for clues. Though no prints were recovered, in the back seat they found a vital piece of evidence. It was a copy of Donna Lee's divorce papers, ending her 15-year marriage to a man named Frank Lee. For investigators, it was the first hint of a motive and of a possible suspect. Detectives quickly obtained a warrant to search Frank Lee's home. In the kitchen, they discovered knives that were similar to the one used to stab Donna Lee and to slay Doris Carassi and Sonia Salinas. Maintaining his innocence, Frank Lee willingly accompanied investigators to the sheriff's department. A physical examination of the suspect revealed no signs that he'd been in a violent struggle. But he admitted that his divorce had turned ugly, and he was bitter that Donna was leaving him for Paul Carassi. Though the impending divorce made Frank Lee the logical suspect, the motive didn't quite seem to fit the murders. For investigators, Paul Carassi should have been the target of the jealous husband's rage, not his mother and ex-girlfriend. Frank Lee was ultimately cleared as a suspect in the double murder. Believing some clue to the killer's identity had been overlooked, examiners turned back to the physical evidence. Criminalist Beverly Kerr started with the T-shirt worn by Paul Carassi at the time of the attacks.
I pulled out Paul's shirt and I looked at it, and we saw something that might have appeared to be a handprint in blood. We all looked at it, we all conferred, and we started feeling that that's possibly what it could be.
DNA testing showed that most of the blood on the T-shirt, particularly in the handprint area, had come from his ex-girlfriend, Sonia Salinas. But Carassi never mentioned that he touched either of the victims. Police decided to question him again. When asked how the blood got on his shirt, Carassi said he'd forgotten that he checked Sonia's pulse after he regained consciousness. He added that he had slipped and fallen in the pools of blood near Sonia's body. He must have wiped her blood off on his shirt. But with each passing minute, investigators began to suspect that Carassi was hiding something.
He went, muddling through the interview saying, well, this and that. And that's just all of a sudden hit me. He said, this guy has got to be, the person I'm looking for, because he just cannot get his story straight.
The investigation's best witness was suddenly the prime suspect in the brutal Mother's Day massacre. Looking to prove that Paul Carassi had murdered his own mother and his ex-girlfriend, investigators turned once again to the crime lab. Now they hoped that the murdered women's own blood would give them proof that he was behind these unspeakable acts. Detectives from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department continued their investigation into a series of vicious knife attacks on Mother's Day that had left 2 women dead and 2 more victims injured. Now they had reason to believe that one of the victims, Paul Carassi, was behind the murders of his mother Doris and his ex-girlfriend Sonia Salinas. To prove it, criminalist Elizabeth Devine began reconstructing the events at the parking garage using Karasi's bloody T-shirt. Though Karasi had previously stated that he slipped in Sonia's blood and then wiped his hands off on his shirt, that explanation didn't jibe with the evidence.
Well, it was clear that a lot more had happened. There was blood spatter, there was contact transfer, which was from Sonia Salinas' neck, which was severely slit. I mean, her head was almost decapitated. Blood soaked all the way through onto his chest. That's not passive transfer of blood. That's not blood on your hands that you wipe on your shirt. That's something bleeding is up against your skin for a period of time.
And examiners determined that the handprint on Karasi's shirt had not come from him. Sonia Salinas had left it. And there was more.
What the blood pattern on the handprint was able to show was that the person that left the handprint was alive because the person clasped the shirt as opposed to just touching the shirt. It also showed that the person that grabbed the shirt was bleeding because we had excessive blood around the fingertips. It wasn't like finger painting where you put your hand in paint and then you put your hand on a shirt. We had it extending beyond the margins of the finger, which means that the person that grasped the shirt was bleeding.
When the blood patterns on the shirt were compared to post-mortem diagrams of Sonia's hands, the injuries didn't all line up. Sonia had sustained more wounds after grasping Paul Karasi's shirt.
She grabbed his shirt and she had not sustained all her wounds. So it was right in the middle of the attack. It was after the wounds started and before the crime ended. And seeing how he said he was on the ground and not involved, along with the spatter and everything else, it showed that not only was he involved, but he was within 3 feet of her, able for her to grasp him.
The analysis locked Karasi into the heat of battle. And further investigation revealed that he had not acted alone. DNA testing proved that blood found on Sonia Salinas' shoe had come from Donna Lee, the woman who survived a knife attack shortly after the murders.
Where's Paul's blood?
That meant the injury to Lee's abdomen had happened at the parking garage, not at the side of the highway, as she previously claimed.
And his shirt was right here.
To prove that Donna Lee had lied to cover up her involvement in the double murder, examiners began looking for answers as to how blood from her injury ended up on the victim's shoe.
The only way you could really get the blood to flow down the shoe in that way was if the shoe was in contact with her abdomen for a sustained period of time. And I tried many different scenarios, many different positions, many different theories about how you could do that. And really the only one I could come up with is that she held her feet to her stomach while Paul slit her throat. And that to me put her right in, you know, that's the business end of that crime scene.
This is Donna's.
Investigators concluded that Donna Lee had been accidentally stabbed in the abdomen as she and Paul struggled to overpower the victims.
Yeah, I answered the question.
Paul Karasi was administered a lie detector test. When asked if he killed his mother and ex-girlfriend, he responded, no.
Bad news for you, okay?
Test results indicated that he was lying.
Here to us, glad here.
Coupled with the forensic evidence, Karasi was placed under arrest.
You have the right to change your mind at any time.
Donna Lee, still recovering in the hospital from her wounds, was also placed under arrest for the double homicide. Investigators believe that Paul Karasi, with Donna Lee at his side, began plotting the murders of his ex-girlfriend and mother when the financial strain of his impending custody battle became too much to bear.
As it is, Paul Karasi made limited money per week, and he had a lot of outstanding bills. So his problem was basically financial and, you know, taking the kid. So how do I plan to take my kid and get all the money, right? So what he's doing now, he's angry at both, because the mother also backed up Sonia. So he's angry at both of them.
On Mother's Day night, As Paul Carassi and his family made their way to the car after having dinner, Donna Lee was waiting nearby with the murder weapon in hand. Their plan to make the murders appear to be a robbery gone bad backfired when Donna Lee became accidentally injured during the assaults and was forced to seek medical attention while attempting to discard the victim's belongings. A jury found Paul Carassi and Donna Lee guilty of first-degree murder. Paul Carassi was sentenced to death. Donna Lee was sentenced to life in prison. For investigators, when a suspect and victim had an intimate relationship in life, proving murder can be a challenge. When the line between familiarity and contempt becomes blurred, it falls to forensic examiners to find the truth and reveal a killer's deadly intentions. A New Jersey woman is found brutally murdered by the side of the road. Investigators must make their case from a few bite marks left on the victim's body. A sadistic predator targets young women in a quiet Canadian community. As police struggle to track him down, the killer threatens more victims. Indiana firefighters discover a woman murdered in her bed. But will dental impressions be enough to convict her killer? Some murderers are compelled to leave a very personal mark on their victims. But with the help of forensic odontologists, police can use those marks to capture those who kill with a deadly smile. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Just after midnight on August 12, 1994, police in Woodbridge, New Jersey were dispatched to a remote area just off Route 1. A battered, semi-nude woman, identified as 25-year-old Melissa Padilla, had been found murdered, lying inside a concrete pipe. Crime technicians began processing the area for clues. They collected several recently purchased grocery items scattered near the body. They also recovered a blood-stained dollar bill and nearby several cigarette butts, which investigators hoped would yield valuable DNA evidence. The victim's discarded shorts, stained with blood, were found nearby. Inside one of the pockets was a store receipt for several grocery items, time-stamped 11:29 p.m. While evidence technicians continued processing the scene, Melissa's boyfriend, Hector Gonzalez, who had found her body, was brought in for questioning. He couldn't imagine anyone who would want to hurt Melissa, a dedicated mother of 4. Hector said that after putting the kids to bed around 11 p.m., Melissa said she wanted to go to a nearby convenience store to pick up a few things. Hector agreed to watch the kids. She said she would be back within a half hour.
Thank you.
When she hadn't returned more than an hour later, he became concerned and asked a friend to help look for her. That's when they found Melissa's battered body along Route 1, the path she normally took to go to the store. Hector later agreed to take a polygraph examination. Test results indicated he had nothing to do with Melissa's murder. Though police had no obvious suspects, the motive behind the murder seemed clear. Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office Lieutenant Lawrence Nagel worked the case.
The woman that was found at the scene was found naked from the waist down. It appeared there was severe trauma to her face area. Initial impressions were that it appeared to be a sexual type of situation.
At autopsy, the medical examiner concluded that Melissa Padilla had died of manual strangulation. Her face had been viciously beaten. Though it was clear she had been sexually assaulted, no biological evidence was recovered. More disturbing was the presence of small contusions on the victim's body. The ones found on Melissa's chin appeared to be bite marks. Knowing the bite marks would be crucial in linking a suspect to the crime, an identification officer with the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office precisely photographed them to scale, using standards developed by the American Board of Forensic Odontologists. For the bite mark evidence to be useful, investigators had to identify a suspect. Trying to retrace Melissa's movements, investigators retrieved the security camera videotape from the store Melissa had been to just before her death. Melissa was clearly visible, purchasing the items found near her body. The amount of change she was seen receiving was the same amount found in her pocket. But no one who appeared in the video looked suspicious. Analysis of the items recovered from the crime scene had little else to offer. Though DNA was found on the cigarette butts, investigators had no way to determine who had left them there or when. And all of the blood that was collected belonged to Melissa. A meticulous search for any suspect fingerprints turned up nothing. Despite the lack of clues to the killer's identity, the bite marks he left behind gave investigators a glimpse into his violent mind. Assistant Prosecutor Thomas Capsack of the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office worked the case.
The nature of the crime suggested anger. The victim was really brutalized. There had to be a lot of pain involved, and we eventually concluded that the bite mark on the chin occurred while he was looking into her eyes while he was causing pain.
Police began focusing their attention on sex offenders known to be living in the area. A state prison facility housing such offenders was located just a few miles from the crime scene. And several inmates had recently been released. Investigators tracked each one of them down. All denied knowledge of Melissa Padilla's murder. And all were eventually cleared by polygraph examinations. Investigators scoured dozens of homicide cases looking for one with a similar MO. But despite their efforts, 8 months passed with no progress in the investigation of Melissa Padilla's murder. But in April 1995, investigators received a call from the Maine State Police. Authorities there were requesting background information on a Woodbridge, New Jersey resident, 31-year-old Stephen Fortin, who was in their custody for sexually assaulting a female Maine State Trooper. For Lieutenant Nagel, the details of the assault sounded eerily familiar.
It was revealed during a conversation with the Maine State Police that the trooper during the assault by Stephen Fortin was bitten in the same immediate areas that Melissa Padilla was bitten on.
Hoping this was the break they had been waiting for, investigators traveled to Maine to speak with the trooper, who was still recovering in the hospital. Investigators immediately noticed that the trooper had sustained bite marks on her chin, the same spot where Melissa Padilla had been bitten. The off-duty trooper said she saw a car parked on the side of the road, facing oncoming traffic.
Open the window!
Concerned, she pulled over.
You having trouble with your car tonight?
The driver claimed to be having mechanical problems,
Okay, I need you to
but
step
the
out of
trooper
car
noticed
shop.
a strong alcohol smell.
Okay, stand right there. Okay, don't move. Don't move. Okay.
She administered a breathalyzer test, which confirmed that the man was intoxicated. As the trooper radioed into the station for backup, the man suddenly attacked her from behind and knocked her unconscious. When she came to, she was in the passenger seat of her patrol car. She was in a great deal of pain and suddenly realized she had been sexually assaulted while unconscious. Believing the assailant was planning to kill her, the trooper jumped out of the car. The driver continued on. The next thing she remembered was waking up in the hospital. Her assailant, Stephen Fortin, was taken into custody less than an hour later. After examining and photographing the trooper's injuries, one thing became clear. The assault on the state trooper and the murder of Melissa Padilla bore the same ritualistic signature.
Ritual involves getting sexual gratification from the crime you commit. The signature in our case really was the ritual, and that is the beating to the eyes and the nose, the bite mark on the chin.
Come over here and check
For
this
investigators, the similar MO of the two assaults had to be more than just a coincidence. New Jersey police went to the jail in Kennebec County, Maine, to question Fortin about the Melissa Padilla homicide. Though Fortin admitted to living in Woodbridge, New Jersey at the time, he insisted he didn't know anyone named Melissa Padilla and denied any knowledge of her murder. He also denied ever being in the area along Route 1, where Melissa's body was found. But he didn't deny his involvement in the assault on the female trooper, though he claimed he had acted in self-defense. Investigators collected hair and blood samples to compare to evidence recovered from the Melissa Padilla crime scene. Though investigators finally had a strong suspect in the young woman's homicide, they were still a long way from proving that Stephen Fortin was her killer. With only bite mark evidence to work with, police in Woodbridge, New Jersey struggled to solve the brutal murder of Melissa Padilla, a 25-year-old mother of 4.
Why don't you move to Maine?
After several months with no leads, police learned of a similar assault more than 300 miles away in Maine. And the suspect in that case, Stephen Fortin, had recently moved there from Woodbridge. While waiting for DNA analysis, New Jersey authorities interviewed Fortin's friends and associates. They located an ex-girlfriend who still lived in Woodbridge. She had plenty to say about Steve Fortin. She said their turbulent 4-month relationship suddenly came to a violent halt after Fortin assaulted her during an argument they had while taking a walk along Route 1. She added that after their fight, Fortin returned to apologize. The girlfriend noticed cuts and scratches on Fortin's face and hands. Fortin explained that he feared she had called the police, and he fled through the woods to avoid them. She believed the incident had taken place on August 12th. Not only was that the night Melissa was murdered, but the girlfriend had put Fortin on Route 1, an area he previously claimed he had never been to. Though investigators were now convinced that Fortin was Melissa Padilla's killer, DNA analysis on the cigarette butt found near her body was inconclusive. Examiners analyzed all of the evidence found at the crime scene again, hoping something may have been overlooked. But nothing was found. For Identification Officer Jim O'Brien, it was clear that the bite marks would be the crucial link connecting Stephen Fortin to Melissa's murder.
The DNA results were inconclusive. We had no hairs or fibers from Stephen Fortin found on the victim's body, and I never developed any fingerprints on any of the evidence that came back to anyone except the victim herself. Therefore, the photographs of the bite marks on the victim's body were very, very important in terms of physical evidence and in terms of putting Stephen Fortin at this crime scene.
In April 1995, Stephen Fortin was taken to the office of Dr. Brian Morin, a dentist in Waterville, Maine. To prove Fortin had made the bite marks on Melissa's body, investigators first needed models detailing every unique feature of his teeth. First, photographs of the suspect's teeth are taken using a millimeter ruler, so examiners can accurately determine the scale of the photos for later comparisons to pictures of the victim's injuries. Then, impressions of the upper and lower teeth are taken using a substance called dental stone, a material similar to plaster. After the molds are allowed to harden, Morin then grinds them down to remove excess material, allowing examiners to clearly see the unique features of the teeth. The molds of the suspect's teeth, in addition to life-size photographs of the bite mark injuries, are all examiners need to perform the analysis. Dr. Tom Richardson, a forensic odontologist in Portland, Maine, explains the process.
The molds of teeth are the casts. They are the likeness of the individual's teeth in size and in shape. The photos are from the individual or medium that was bitten, and they are life-size as well. We take the casts, put an overlay, go up against the marks on the photo, and we either are going to have a match if the photos are good and the marks are there, or we're not going to.
Using a computer program, examiners demonstrated how the casts made of Stephen Fortin's teeth lined up perfectly with the bite marks on the victim's chin. The spacing between Fortin's teeth, the dimensions of the arches of his bite, and the unique details of his teeth were all consistent with the injuries on both victims. Detectives now had the physical proof they needed to charge Stephen Fortin with the murder of Melissa Padilla. Police believe that Stephen Fortin chanced upon Melissa as she returned from the convenience store. Still enraged by the argument with his girlfriend, Fortin brutally beat, bit, and sexually assaulted her before finally strangling her to death. In February 2001, he was sentenced to death in New Jersey for the murder and aggravated sexual assault of Melissa Padilla. He also pled guilty to charges stemming from the beating and sexual assault on the Maine state trooper. He received the maximum 20-year sentence. Stephen Fortin found gratification in a brutal ritual. But 3,000 miles away in Canada, in a quiet suburb of Vancouver, one killer took perverse satisfaction from taunting the detectives on his trail. Abbotsford, British Columbia, Canada, October 14, 1995. In the early morning hours, officers from the Abbotsford Police Department were dispatched to a hospital emergency room. There, they found 16-year-old Melissa Connor, still recovering from a brutal beating she sustained a few hours earlier. Melissa told investigators that she and a friend, Tracy Sawyer, were on their way to a party when a man wielding a baseball bat jumped out of the bushes and attacked them. During the struggle, Melissa was knocked unconscious. When she came to, Tracy and the assailant were nowhere in sight. Though her recollection of the attack was still a bit hazy, Melissa was certain she had never seen the man before. Investigators rushed to the scene of the assault to search for Tracy. But only one item found at the scene suggested that a struggle had taken place. A single hoop earring that belonged to the missing teenager. Inspector Rod Gale of the Abbotsford Police Department hoped a canvass of the neighborhood would yield information.
There were witnesses in the area of the crime scene, but the witnesses that we established there had only heard screams in the early hours of the morning, and no one had actually seen anything.
Okay.
Investigators feared that the 16-year-old Tracy Sawyer had been abducted, or worse. And with no suspects to pursue, they knew that time was working against them. A description of the missing teenager and details of the assault were distributed to all area law enforcement agencies. A few hours later, a man fishing along the Vedder River noticed something on the riverbank. As he moved closer to get a better look, he realized he had found a human body. Officers of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who responded to the scene found that the young female victim had been savagely beaten and raped. Police scoured the shoreline for clues that could help them identify the young woman and her killer. But they found nothing. Still, officers of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police believed this was the missing Abbotsford girl. Sergeant Kevin McLeod.
The obvious connection to me to the Abbotsford case was the fact that Abbotsford had a missing girl and we had a dead girl. And this is close vicinity of the two communities.
Dental records confirmed that the woman found at the Vedder River was Tracy Sawyer. The medical examiner confirmed that the young woman had been raped. He also noted massive blunt force trauma to her head. But that wasn't what killed her. The official cause of death was ruled a drowning. The only clues to the killer's identity were bite marks on the victim's torso. The impressions were carefully photographed and preserved as evidence. The photos were sent to the Bureau of Legal Dentistry Laboratory in Vancouver. There, Dr. David Sweet, a recognized expert in forensic odontology, examined the evidence. After studying the bite mark injuries, he realized there was the potential for additional evidence to be obtained.
A new technique was available for recovering saliva from a bite mark, and we could even determine if DNA was available from the saliva and then possibly match that back to the suspect when and if one was made available.
The theory behind the technique, referred to as double swabbing, is that saliva from the suspect's mouth is transferred into the bite marks left on the victim. As demonstrated here, Dr. Sweet first dampens a sterile swab with distilled water, then wipes it across the impressions, rehydrating any saliva cells in the bite marks. Then, he applies a second dry swab to the wounds, which will act as a sponge and collect the rehydrated cells that contain the suspect's DNA. Dr. Sweet performed the procedure on the teeth impressions found on Tracy Sawyer. And though she had been submerged in water for some time, he was confident the double swabbing technique would yield DNA evidence.
Despite the fact that the body had been in water, the saliva is sticky enough in order to remain there, and if you can use some methods to collect that evidence that's there, even in trace forms, you'll have enough to test and to analyze.
The procedure was successful. minute traces of the killer's DNA was collected. But for that evidence to be useful, investigators would now have to find a way to identify a suspect. A forensic odontologist had successfully extracted the killer's DNA from bite marks found on 16-year-old murder victim Tracy Sawyer. But for the evidence to be useful, police in Abbotsford, British Columbia, now had to identify a suspect. They turned to the victim's parents for information. The couple said that the last time they saw Tracy was shortly before the assault. She and her friend, Melissa Connor, were leaving for a party at a neighborhood friend's house. They promised not to be out too late. Tracy seemed upbeat and excited about the party.
That night she looked so happy.
The couple couldn't think of a single person who would want to hurt their beautiful young daughter. In addition to releasing limited details of the investigation to the media, police also set up a tip line for potential witnesses to call with information. Soon after, a call came in. The man on the other end claimed to be Tracy's killer. He described in detail the bite mark found on the victim's body.
The only people that would know about it were the people at the autopsy, the doctors, the policemen attending the autopsy, and the immediate core team of the investigation. So it had to be the individual that had intimate knowledge of the crime scene to know about that bite mark.
Police traced the call to a nearby payphone and rushed to the scene. But no one was there. Technicians thoroughly dusted the phone for any fingerprints the suspect may have left behind. None were found. A short while later, Abbotsford police dispatchers received a 911 call. During the conversation, which was recorded by police, a man identified himself as the killer. He wanted to know if police were having trouble finding him. He said he would never be so stupid as to leave his prints at the payphone.
Hey, where are you gonna be?
He also promised to kill again.
Hello? Are you there?
It's not very often that a suspect starts phoning the police and threatening to attack again, threatening to do the same thing over again, and basically taunting that you're not going to be able to catch me, I'm going to do this again.
Desperate to stop this killer before he struck again, police turned back to Melissa Connor, the young woman who had survived the assault that had claimed the life of her best friend. Though her memory of the events had not fully recovered, she tried to describe the assailant to a sketch artist the best she could. She remembered the man as being a tall white male, balding, but with reddish-brown hair. The information was enough for police to formulate a composite sketch, which was quickly released through the media. The press dubbed him the Abbotsford Killer. A few days later, a woman came forward with information. She recognized the man in the sketch. He appeared to be the same man who had attacked her with a baseball bat several months before. When shown a photo lineup, she picked out a man named John Eller. For the first time in the murder investigation, authorities had a viable suspect. In November 1995, more than a month after Tracy Sawyer's murder, detectives arrested John Eller at his home. He vehemently denied being the Abbotsford killer. After taking impressions of the suspect's teeth, forensic odontologist Dr. David Sweet compared them to the bite marks found on Tracy Sawyer's body. But investigators would be frustrated by the results of his analysis.
It became obvious very quickly that the spacing and the shapes of his teeth were much different than the teeth that would be necessary to cause this bite mark.
And DNA samples from the suspect did not match the DNA Dr. Sweet had extracted from the bite marks. John Eller was eventually cleared as a suspect in Tracy's murder. Soon after, the taunting phone calls from the Abbotsford killer resumed. Frustrated, authorities came up with a plan. Convinced that someone somewhere knew the killer, they decided to release the recordings of the Abbotsford killer's taunting phone calls made to police.
The general public were able to hear a large variety of voice characteristics of the individual that was calling us, and that was our goal. We also had that tape on a callback line at the police office, so anybody could call a designated number and just listen to the tape. They didn't have to talk to a police officer, they could just phone and listen to the tape over and over again.
The plan appeared to be a success. A woman who listened to the recordings came forward. She recognized the voice. Detectives played the tape for her again. She told them it sounded like a man named Terry Driver.
So you're positive that's your son?
She knew the voice, she said, because Terry Driver was her son. And she knew that he owned a police scanner and listened to it often at his home. Detectives quickly began checking Driver's background. Though he had no criminal record, the 32-year-old printer lived with his wife and 2 kids in the same neighborhood where the taunting phone calls had originated. Terry Driver was brought in for questioning. Though Driver adamantly denied being the Abbotsford killer, detectives collected hair and saliva for DNA analysis. Photographs and wax casts of Driver's teeth were also taken. At the Bureau of Legal Dentistry in Vancouver, Dr. Sweet looked for similarities between Driver's dental evidence and bite marks found on Tracy Sawyer's body.
I produced a clear overlay with the biting edges of his teeth recorded on it at life size, and then compared that to the photographs that were enlarged to life size also.
Dr. Sweet identified several unique characteristics in the suspect's bite that convinced him that Terry Driver's teeth were consistent with the bite marks on Tracy Sawyer's body.
He had some chipped teeth as well as some crowding or rotations of teeth so that they were out of position and not where you would normally find them. This made his teeth unique from everybody else's, and those features were recorded in the bite mark also.
But the irrefutable proof came from the DNA analysis. Terry Driver's DNA profile matched the profile of the DNA Dr. Sweet had extracted from the bite mark injuries. Dr. Sweet's double swabbing technique helped police clinch their case against a sadistic killer. Terry Driver was arrested and charged with the murder of 16-year-old Tracy Sawyer and the attempted murder of her friend, Melissa Connor. Based on the evidence, Abbotsford police believed Terry Driver was a sick predator driven by an insatiable need for attention. On October 14, 1995, that craving exploded into violence. As Melissa Connor and Tracy Sawyer made their way to a nearby party, Driver attacked them without warning. After viciously raping and killing Tracy, Driver set out to taunt police and to prove that he was invincible. In October of 1997, Terry Driver was convicted of the sexual assault slaying of Tracy Sawyer and sentenced to life in prison. He received an additional 10 years for for the attempted murder of Melissa Connor. Terry Driver was compelled to call attention to his crimes. But in Indiana, another murderer went to great lengths to conceal his guilt. On October 6, 1990, at 11:37 p.m., firefighters in Shelbyville, Indiana, responded to a blaze at a nearby apartment complex. The fire was coming from the bedroom of 42-year-old Shirley Sturgill, a tenant who lived on the second floor. After extinguishing the fire on the bed, one of the firefighters made a grisly discovery: the badly burned body of a woman. And the strong smell of lighter fluid led rescue workers to conclude that this fire was no accident. After extinguishing a blaze in an apartment in Shelbyville, Indiana, firefighters had uncovered the badly burned remains of a woman lying in a bed. And according to Chief Kurt Etherton of the Shelbyville Police Department, all indications suggested she had been the victim of a homicide.
It appeared a fire had been started either on or around the bed. There was an inverted V pattern, which is consistent with a fire where accelerants had been used. So it was our opinion that the fire had been set at that point.
After confirming that the victim was the tenant, 42-year-old Shirley Sturgill, evidence technicians began searching for clues to tell them who had started the deadly blaze and why. Several latent prints were located and preserved as evidence. But later analysis revealed they all belonged to the victim. Investigators also collected 2 different brands of cigarette butts. DNA analysis later revealed the presence of 2 distinct DNA profiles, and neither matched the victim. It appeared Shirley Sturgill's killer, or killers, had unsuccessfully tried to burn away any trace of evidence from the crime scene. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Shirley had not died as a result of the fire. She had been strangled to death. She had also been sexually assaulted. But the biological evidence recovered was too degraded for a thorough analysis. And there was more. Several marks were found on the victim's torso, stomach, and thigh. The ME concluded they were bite marks made from human teeth. For investigators, they were the strongest link to Shirley's killer.
That person told us that if we had a suspect, that they could take impressions and he would be able to determine whether or not those bite marks were made by a particular person, because there were some distinctive markings on the bites that would be consistent with someone's teeth not being aligned straight.
What time was it when
Detectives began their hunt for Shirley Sturgill's killer by speaking with her daughter. Angie Carr said she and her mother were very close. She couldn't think of anyone who would want to hurt her. She described her mother as a kind, sensitive, and selfless woman who dedicated her life to Angie's happiness and well-being. She was also a wonderful grandmother to Angie's young children. Angie had spoken to her mother on the phone just an hour or so before firefighters were called to the apartment. There didn't seem to be anything troubling her mother. The victim did mention during the conversation that her next-door neighbor, Jerry Donaldson, was there visiting at the time. It was a name already familiar to detectives. Arson investigators who had responded to Shirley's apartment the night of the murder said a neighbor was asking a lot of questions and seemed to know specific details of the crime itself. His name was Jerry Donaldson.
They said that the neighbor was telling several things about the crime that he felt no one else would probably know.
So when did you last...
Donaldson was brought in for questioning. He admitted visiting Shirley the night she died. She had hurt her back recently, and he checked in on her periodically to see if she needed anything. He said they watched TV, and about 10:30, after smoking a cigarette, he went home. When asked how he knew so much about the murder, Donaldson claimed he'd overheard the firefighters talking. He agreed to provide hair samples for a DNA analysis.
Where were you?
Donaldson's DNA was consistent with DNA recovered from one of the cigarette butts found in the victim's apartment. And though he had never denied being there, investigators were convinced he knew more about the murder than he claimed. On October 24th, nearly 3 weeks after Shirley Sturgill's murder, police arrested Jerry Donaldson on suspicion of murder. They also obtained a court order requiring impressions of his teeth to be made. A forensic odontologist overlaid impressions of the suspect's teeth over photographs of Shirley Sturgill's bite mark injuries. Though they didn't line up perfectly, the examiner felt that the two were consistent. But the suspect's lawyers saw to it that Donaldson would never stand trial for murder.
The defense team hired, I think, 2 different odontologists from other parts of the country who had differing opinions than the odontologists we used. The prosecutor and his staff sat down with the defense team and went over the discrepancies, which eventually led to the release of the suspect.
For Shelbyville detectives, the setback was frustrating. The investigation into Shirley Sturgill's savage murder had ground to a halt. Investigators were back to square one, and with no obvious suspects to pursue. Shelbyville, Indiana police struggled to solve the brutal homicide of 42-year-old Shirley Sturgill. Though teeth marks had been found on the victim's body, investigators had no other clues to the killer's identity. A year after the homicide, the case was turned over to Captain Bill Dwenger.
One of the things that struck me as odd, it was the amount of anger or rage that was built up inside someone that could inflict these type of injuries on another human being.
After re-examining dozens of witness statements taken over the previous year, Dwenger noticed that several people had commented that Shirley and her son-in-law had not gotten along. Though that didn't seem so unusual, investigators decided to talk with Shirley's daughter Angie again, and to her husband, John Del Carr.
Could I just get a copy of the...
Mr. Carr, we're here investigating the murder.
John Del Carr was upfront about his feelings for his mother-in-law. He didn't like her, and they argued often. Mostly about Shirley's constant interfering with his marriage. He said that on the night of the murder, he was with an old Army buddy who was visiting from out of town. He hadn't seen Shirley that day. Angie corroborated her husband's alibi. Though John Del Carr was still considered a suspect, police had no evidence against him.
Okay, I think you need to get on that.
But a month later, detectives learned that John Del Carr had been arrested for murdering a young woman in nearby Hamilton County, Indiana. Though no bite marks were left on this victim, she had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The same MO as the murder of Shirley Sturgill.
Yeah, I did the girl in Hamilton. That's what I'm in here.
Shelbyville detectives drove to the state prison to speak with John Del Carr and obtain potential evidence. But the suspect was uncooperative and refused to answer any questions.
We'll get a
Investigators ultimately collected hair and blood samples for DNA comparisons with evidence recovered from Shirley's apartment. At the crime lab, examiners concluded that John Del Carr's DNA was consistent with DNA from one of the cigarette butts found in Shirley's bedroom. John Del Carr had been at the victim's apartment, something he previously denied. Though it was strong circumstantial evidence, it didn't prove that he was the killer. There was only one way investigators could make their case. They needed impressions of John Del Carr's teeth to compare to the bite marks found on Shirley Sturgill's body. But so far, they lacked probable cause to obtain a warrant to force the suspect to provide the samples. And they knew that without that evidence, it would be difficult to get a conviction.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We needed to know, and the jury's going to need to know, did we get his dental impressions? Did they match up to the bite marks on the body of Shirley Sturgill? Without that, I'm not sure a jury would be able to find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So we needed that information, whether it was going to be, yes, they do match up, or no, they do not.
On August 3rd, 1994, almost 4 years after the murder, investigators finally got a break. Angie Carr had since divorced her husband, and now that he was in prison, she wanted to talk. She believed John Del Carr had in fact murdered her mother. She admitted to having lied to police before, but out of fear for her safety and the safety of her children. According to Angie, John came home very late the night of the murder. Suddenly, he grabbed a shotgun, pointed it at her, and told her he had hurt her mother. He dragged her to the room where her children were sleeping and threatened to kill her and them if she ever said anything. Angie told police that John kept up his threats in the following months.
The kids' room.
Besides hurting your back.
And she believed he wouldn't hesitate to carry them out.
Put a shotgun to their heads and threatened to kill them too.
John Carr's wife, I believe, was genuinely terrified of John. She knew what he was capable of. I think she did what she had to do to protect herself and her children.
It was the break detectives had been waiting for. Angie's testimony was enough for investigators to obtain a court order to force John Del Carr to give teeth impressions. Investigators contacted forensic odontologist Dr. John Kenny, the deputy coroner for DuPage County, Illinois.
I was asked to go to the state prison and to meet with Mr. Carr in the dental infirmary and to take his impressions and any other records as I would need to make a bite mark comparison.
Okay. But John Del Carr still refused to cooperate.
Okay.
Investigators received another court order, this time giving them the authority to anesthetize the suspect in order to obtain the evidence.
It was possible in this particular case to, because of the configuration of Mr. Carr's teeth, several of his teeth were misaligned and crowded, particularly on the upper arch, to take the model of his teeth and fit it right to the injury in one of these positive replicas.
All of the unique characteristics of John Del Carr's teeth matched the injuries present on Shirley Sturgill's body. There was no doubt that his teeth had left the wounds. Police believe that on October 6, 1990, John Del Carr, resentful of his mother-in-law's interference in his marriage, drove to her apartment and confronted her. His anger exploded into violence. Carr beat, bit, and sexually assaulted Shirley Sturgill before strangling her to death. After, he set her apartment on fire, hoping all traces of his crime would burn away. In April 1997, John Del Carr was convicted of the first-degree murder of his mother-in-law, Shirley Sturgill. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Some killers are driven to leave a very personal mark on their victims. When police have little other evidence to work with, they turn to forensic odontologists, who seize upon those marks to take the bite out of a killer's deadly smile.